Thank you all for joining us. We'll give everyone just a few minutes to get settled before we get started. A few more people connect their audio. Okay, well, it looks like we've got a good group here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. My name is Hannah Jacob, and I am an assistant director in the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement, and I am thrilled to welcome you all tonight to this reunion back to school class, Equity in Education, What Does It Look Like, and How Do We Get There? I want to take a second and just thank the Class of 2001 20th Reunion Planning Committee for putting this together. This is in celebration of their 20th reunion this year, and so we really appreciate everything that they've done to work on this. Just a few notes before we do get started. We are going to have everyone muted throughout the event, but there will be a Q&A period at the end. So if you have questions for our speakers, David and Liz, you can submit those through the chat. If you can send them to Grace Ward, and she'll put a note about that in the chat. She will be moderating the questions, but please don't send anything directly to David and Liz because they will not be monitoring the chat during the event. You can also handle any technical questions to Grace, and she'll help with any troubleshooting to get you settled throughout the event. We do recommend that you use speaker view. So if you're on a computer screen, you can adjust that in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And I'm going to turn on the live transcript. If you would like to disable that, you should see a CC live transcript button, and you can turn that off. We will be posting this event to YouTube, and we will have captions afterward. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers. So Liz Neheisel Self, class of 01, is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College, where she teaches social foundations courses in the elementary and secondary licensure programs and courses on humanizing pedagogies and design-based research in non-licensure graduate programs. Liz is the director of the SHIFT project, which uses live actor simulated encounters to prepare teachers as anti-oppressive educators, and recently published a book on the topic titled Toward Anti-Oppressive Teaching, Designing and Using Simulated Encounters with Harvard Education Press. Liz currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee with her husband, Wes, also class of 2001. Their three kids, Oliver, Emmeline, and Zola, and then two ill-behaved dogs. Also joining us this evening is David Stroop, class of 02. David is an associate professor of teacher education and science education, the associate director of STEM teacher education at the Create for STEM Institute, and the director of science and society at Michigan State University. He has three overlapping areas of research interests anchored around ambitious and equitable teaching. First, he frames classrooms as science practice communities using lenses from science, technology, and society, and the history and philosophy of science. He examines how teachers and students disrupt epistemic injustice through the negotiation of power, knowledge, and epistemic agency. Second, he examines how beginning teachers learn from practice in and across their varied contexts. And third, he studies how teacher preparation programs can provide support and opportunities for beginning teachers to learn from practice. David also recently published a book with Harvard Education Press, this one titled Preparing Science Teachers Through Practice-Based Teacher Education. I would now like a round of applause for making it through those bios. But now I will go ahead and mute myself, and we'll let David and Liz take it away. They are going to have a great conversation. And then, like I said, for about the last 20 or so minutes, we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions throughout, send them to Grace through the chat, and we'll go ahead and let them get started. So take it away, David and Liz.
Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. So we really appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Liz and I have really enjoyed reconnecting around education work, and I think we'll get to that in a little bit, but it's been really fun. So we appreciate the invitation to share ideas with you, and we just wanted to have a conversation between ourselves about some of the topics at hand for the reunion series, and then what we're up to in our work, and then we want to open it up for questions. So Liz, I feel like you are probably really well positioned to answer the first question that we wanted to ask ourselves, which was I know a big emphasis of the reunion series is about equity, and we're specifically thinking about equity in our work. So how do we position ourselves with respect to issues of equity in education? Maybe let's start there.
Yeah. So usually on the first day of the classes I teach, as I kind of go over what my undergraduate course that I teach every semester is about, I sort of have a slide that's like, why is there a white lady talking to me about social issues, right? And so that's something that we put at the front of the work that we do, just in terms of what we call positionality. So how am I situated within society to come to this conversation? And so a lot of the work that I do is just to think about and talk with students about, what am I in a position to talk about? What is my area of expertise and what's not? And being very humble and open about the stuff that I'm like, that's not my lane. And that's something I can speak to firsthand. So the questions about like, what is equity and how do we get there are questions that are definitely beyond my expertise in terms of like the scale and scope. And questions that really can only be answered by the people who are positioned as marginalized in these systems of oppression. And so, we go to communities of color, we talk to Asian American folks right now who are dealing with violence. We are talking to, Black communities around police brutality. We're talking to, here in Tennessee, talking a lot to the LGBTQ plus community about what equity looks like for them in a state, that it's pretty hostile towards them. So those are, conversations that I'm not part of, where I do just a lot of listening. But as a teacher educator, you do have to have some answers to these questions, especially as you prepare teachers to go out into schools, where we hope that they participate in making schools more equitable spaces for students who have historically and continue to be really underserved in very intentional and then sometimes in more invisible ways. So at a really broad scale, when I think about equity in education, I think about both the experience that children, family, and communities have while they're in the school system. And I also think about the outcomes that are possible for them. And so when we think about equity in education, and the part that I tend to talk a lot more about because of the work that I do, I'm really focused on, what is it like for a kid to be in your classroom? What is it like for a kindergartner on their first day of school to walk in? What is it like for parents who are sitting in an IEP meeting, finding out that their child, has a learning disability, and how is that going to be served? What is it like for an 11th grade, Latinx student who's thinking about dropping out? Like, these are situations that kids find themselves in. What is school like for them? And what can teachers in particular, recognizing that there are lots of systems levels higher than that have to be involved, what can they do? Like, what should they be thinking about? What might not be obvious to them? And that is for both teachers who don't identify with the child that they're thinking about, or the community or the families, and for those that do. So a lot of the work we've done the last couple years in my classes is for, educators of color, for example. So when I have a Black student in the classroom and we're talking about these school to prison pipeline phenomena, or how subjective disciplinary infractions, saying that a kid's being disrespectful, plays into that. Black teachers are often themselves thinking about, like, well, what does that look like for me? Is it possible that I would perpetuate that? How do I resist that as an educator of color, or specifically as a Black or Latinx or Asian educator? So that's all bound up there. And then the other part is the outcomes piece. And that outcomes piece, for my purposes, is a lot about talking about, what does success look like as defined by the kids and families and communities. So it is about making sure students have access to the possibilities that exist in society, that are often gatekept by things like standardized tests and your grades in school and things like that. But for, a lot of kids and families, it's like, I want to leave school and feel like I can be wildly successful in this field I've chosen and still be part of my community, that I don't have to, quote unquote, escape it, right, to feel successful. Or for multilingual families, I want my child to get through school and I want them to speak English in a way that lets them go do whatever they want, but I want them to have the language that we speak at home also. So that's what equity for me looks like. It's like, what is that experience really like for kids, families, and communities in school while they're with us for those 13 years? And I'm definitely like a K-12 person. And then, what's possible for them beyond that? And does it provide success, not just in the ways that society, which is, again, normed around white middle class and upper class values defined as, but also what those communities really want from school. So that's how I come at the work, and always bounded by uncertainty, transparency, and just sort of constant reflection and questioning of self around what that work looks like. So David, I know you and I have a lot of overlap there, but you are definitely more in the academic discipline with science than I am. So what does this look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, given our limited time, I'll just build on what you said, because I think we try and do a lot of that work in our teacher preparation program as well, especially situating students in a K-12 classroom as actors in a larger community that have really important ideas about what their needs and problems are that we want our teachers to learn to pay attention to. I think, so more specifically, from the science perspective, there's like two big things that we really think about around equity, and especially me as a white man, as you noted, sort of being the leader of this class. The first one is that as a teacher and as a teacher educator, you're positioned with power. Whether you want to be or not, you have it. And so the question that we have our future teachers think a lot about is, what do I want to do with this power? And so we really have them rehearse, as we'll get into, the moment-to-moment interactions that they want to engage in with students, because how they treat students' ideas, how they treat students, especially around their science ideas in a science classroom, have huge short-term and long-term ripple effects for how the students feel about being able to do science, what they feel like their possibilities are for their future. So we really have our teachers think about the relational and humanizing work of engaging with students in their immediate class. The second big thing we think about is that science itself has been really useful for a lot of things. So hopefully everyone out there is getting their COVID vaccines, and you can give a head nod to science for that one. But we also know that science has a really troubled history, especially with Black and Brown communities, and even beyond that it's been purposefully exclusive. And you mentioned some of the gatekeeping things, right? So our teachers, our future science teachers, often come in with a really skewed version of what science is. And so we have to be both really disruptive with them about, you've been really successful in science classes in K-12 and now K-16 environments, but that's not really what science is and how it operates. And so we have to disrupt this sort of mythology they built up around what counts as science. But then we also have to give them opportunities to rebuild sort of the kind of science they want to do as students. And then we link that with the kind of instruction that they want to be able to accomplish, often and hopefully being grounded in the students' communities and lived experiences. And we also have them think about over the course of a year, right? So it's really hard to just sort of drop in and say, hey, let's do some really cool science now. Because as you noted, things come up, you have to get to know students in their communities really well. So we have them take a long-term look at, if by May or June, we want students really taking on science problems that are grounded in their community. What does that mean for me in September? What do I have to start doing? How do we have to start creating a classroom in which everyone feels safe and valued to share ideas? How do we create a classroom in which, they trust me and I trust them as human beings to engage in really complex work? So we have them take a long view of sort of their work. For me as a teacher educator, it means that I have to represent that work, right? So I have to be very conscious of the things that I say and do, especially around equity when equity questions arise, which they always should and do. And I have to be really purposeful about how I talk about my positionality and the things that I say and do, because they see me with power as someone who is showing them what teaching is. So they would be quick to point out the hypocrisy if I lectured to them in really inequitable ways about why equity was important, right? So as you know, being a teacher educator is a lot of work, but it's wonderfully rewarding work. So maybe let's think back, because we are at a Davidson alumni reunion event. I don't know that many people who started Davidson end up in careers like us. So how did you, Liz, like what kinds of experiences at Davidson can you sort of trace back to and say that kind of got me on the path that I'm on now?
Yeah. So when I was at Davidson, I spent a lot of time thinking about education in very general ways. So I don't like, I remember having a lot of thoughts about my own K-12 schooling experience. I was an Air Force kid and we moved around a lot and I went to a lot of different schools and it provided some instant comparisons and that kind of thing. But I don't think I showed up at Davidson thinking that education would be a big part of what I would do long-term. I was a center major, which was English and German for me. And I was a Bonner Scholar, which we both were. And I saw Ida on here and Anne, Gary's also on here. I know there might be other Bonner Scholars. So hi. And I think Bonner like provided a space and opportunity for me to spend some time thinking about education and how it happens, tutoring, working with kids. I taught for Summer Bridge after, I think, my first year of college, which is now the Breakthrough program. And I'm sending my students off to go teach with them now, which is really cool. I remember writing a paper for Cynthia Lewis in a nonfiction class after spending time in a classroom at one of the local Davidson schools. I wrote my thesis on the Americanization of the German university system. So I was very interested in how schools sort of replicate cultural values and all that kind of thing. I graduated. I had a really awesome fellowship to go overseas. I went for like a month and got super sick. I came back to the States. And then I literally, when I tell my students this story and I say, and then I did what you're not supposed to do and I followed a boy. And so my now spouse was starting medical school in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I moved out there and found a job. And about a year after I was out there, I decided I wanted to teach. I taught for 3 years in Virginia. No real teaching experience, no teacher license before I started. They were like, you have an English degree from a school we recognize, go forth and teach. And, you know, in retrospect, recognize the things that were like good instincts and the things where they're like, that was totally replicating all of the traditional ways of teaching English. Spent time there, married the boy, went to Chicago, and then I taught at an all-girls charter school in Chicago. And that was where I sort of went from thinking about teaching to thinking about very particular parts of teaching, namely, like, how did I become a white woman teaching at a predominantly Black and Latina school, not having thought much about my race, their race, racism, white supremacy, gender, like any of these things, and was in a really fantastic school with a very supportive colleagues in that. So we then moved to Nashville for Wes to take a job here at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And I, at that point, I was like, I have a teacher's license. I have national board certification. I've done years. I'm good at state testing. Could not get a phone call, could not get an interview to continue teaching. And I was like, well, they have this okay school of education here. I guess I could look at that. And I ended up doing a master's degree and started my PhD with somebody who in my world is kind of famous. So Rich Milner, who has written several books, he's actually the president-elect of our huge conference incoming. Got to study with him for a couple of years and then finished with somebody that David eventually overlapped with, Lonnie Horn, who studies teacher learning a lot. And we just kind of stayed, and my institution was kind enough to keep me and let me then move into a more permanent position. So what I got from Davidson was like, let's think about education. Let's think in deep and critical ways. And like, let's put you in a situation where you can just sort of do whatever work is in front of you until you figure out, deeply what you care about. So that's kind of my path. David, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, we should give a big shout out to the Bonner program, because I feel like there's a lot of Bonner people who go into sort of education like work. So that's been a lot of fun. I had a different but sort of similar path, which was, so Bonner Scholar work for me was excellent. And of course, we all did the tutoring at the Ada Jenkins Center, right, which is great. And that was a good experience and getting a taste of what teaching was like. I actually did more classroom experiences when I was a biology major. So we would go around and we would go to different classrooms in the area, pre-K through high school. I did a couple of things at the Davidson Presbyterian Church preschool there with little 4-year-olds. That was a lot of fun. But we would go around and we would show them different critters. And it was just so fun to hang out with kids and answer their questions about animals and let them touch different kinds of animals. So then I, like you, followed my now wife. So we're like 2 for 2 on that. I followed my now wife to Houston. We met at Davidson as well. And I thought, I don't know that I wanted to be a career biologist. So I kind of liked teaching. How hard can teaching be? which now seems like a really funny question to ask myself. But at the time, it made a lot of sense, right? So I also got certified quickly through like a 6-week certification program, which in retrospect too, I think gives us an interesting insight onto some of these sort of fast track programs. So I got certified in 6 weeks because Texas needs teachers quite badly. And then I had my own middle school classroom 6 weeks later. So I taught 7th grade science. My sort of first dive into education, especially sort of policy stuff, was the first superintendent that I encountered was a guy named Rod Page, who then went on to become Secretary of Education and started No Child Left Behind in 2002. So I sort of met him, I remember meeting him. Then he left and then we had a new superintendent come in, but my first year teaching was the first year that we started to compile the data that he would then take to Congress and make the case for No Child Left Behind, right? So I've been in this sort of testing game since the beginning. So that was my first sort of inkling about something was strange about the science that was happening, and especially around math and reading as well in classrooms. And Houston has a really high teacher turnover rate. So by year 4, I was a mentor teacher, just as I was sort of getting my own grounding as a teacher. And my thought, like yours, was like, how on earth have I ended up in this position? It's like a white guy teaching in a really diverse school. Somehow I'm now supposed to show a new teacher, like I'm a new teacher. How am I supposed to show a new teacher what to do? So I got really interested in the teacher education side of things and thinking about this, like there must be better ways to prepare teachers than what I experienced. So then I started looking around at programs and I found one at the University of Washington that was doing, this is where Lonnie Horn overlaps. So I started really thinking about teacher education work. And we now joke that we are making a lap around the outside of the country. So from North Carolina to Texas to Washington and now Michigan. So we're just making a loop around. I'm really intrigued that we have both ended up in teacher education work. And so also that we both have books coming out a month apart about teacher education work. So I would say for me, if I ever tell someone on an airplane about what I do, which I'm sometimes cautious to do, if I ever say that I'm in education, I think one of the top questions I get is what, like, tell me, well, I don't know if it's a question. I think it's more of a, let me tell you about my favorite teacher or something, but it's definitely something that people want to know. Like, why does teacher preparation matter so much? So what do you tell your students, or like, why do you like to teach these classes at Vanderbilt?
I do think part of the reason I really like teaching some of my main classes is because it is taking what seems like a simple kind of thing and really showing the complexity behind it. So Deborah Ball, who is someone else who's very well known in our field, talks about the invisible work of teaching. Dan Lordy, who's like old school, but he talks about the apprenticeship of teaching. We've all spent all these years in school watching teachers. And so we're pretty sure we know what teaching involves because we watched it happen. And on the one hand, you're like, yeah, that's kind of commonsensical. And then when you start trying to do it, you realize how much you miss. So I think part of the reason that I love doing the work is because I find it interesting in thinking about like, okay, what does good teaching take, right? Like what all is involved in that? How is it that all these people that know all these different things, have different life experiences, could all come to be good teachers? And if that is the case, how do we describe it at a high enough level that it makes sense for all these people, but specific enough that we can teach somebody new how to do it, which is kind of a constant tension in teacher education. And because the stuff I get to talk about related to teacher education is constantly in response to society, right? The title of my main course is Social and Philosophical Aspects of Education, which is a really big title, which is like, you know, how do schools pick up what's going on in society, and how in some cases do they just replicate what's happening, and could it be different somehow? And that really is the question we ask. So every semester we're getting to talk about things like, you know, do racial disparities exist when kids go into school, or are we making that happen? And is there a way we cannot make that happen? And how do we know if we do that, if we agree that the measurement that we're using itself is racially biased? Like, we get to have questions that don't have simple answers. And I think that's a lot of what we talk about with teaching itself, is there aren't simple answers to that, but that doesn't mean there's no answers. That doesn't mean there's no information or no places to start. So we spend a lot of time talking about complexity. We talk about, there's a line I love from this one article, talks about enlarging the space of the possible. And that's a line I use with the teachers a lot, that our job isn't just to make sure they can go off and do X, Y, and Z, but to just what would it look like to teach in a way that you literally expand what's possible for kids and in the world, kind of thing. And then again, constantly, one of our last weeks that we talk a lot about, how do I have to constantly and continuously sort of watch myself in what I'm doing, right? So a lot of times teachers will say like, well, aren't we just brainwashing them, or aren't we just telling them what we think? And I'm like, you're exactly right. If you do it this way, that is what you're doing. So what does it look like to expose them to lots more ideas, perspectives, events, but in a way that says at the end of the day, I acknowledge the autonomy that you have and, you have to go off and decide what to do with that. So those are questions we wrestle with, and they're questions that we don't have clear, simple answers to for ourselves. And I think that's part of what I enjoy doing it. And as you said, because we're doing it too. So it's a very meta kind of work where you're talking about it with students, but everything you're talking about with them, you're having to make sense of for yourself in that classroom. And there's been a heavy overlap with parenting for me the last few years too. So that's probably added to it as well. How about you with science?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, just to quickly touch on your last point, I think for my future teachers, that's a time when they're most sort of surprised about teacher education work, is when we get to be really public about our own decision making as teachers. Like if I'm struggling with something that someone has said, I'll say to the class, like, let's puzzle through this together. And they're like, don't you just know? No, I sure don't. So yeah, I think they like sort of the public thinking about it. We overlap so much in our thinking about this. So you can tell that we've spent a lot of time thinking and talking to similar people and engaging with similar ideas. For me, I do think that we can all think back to a teacher that we really enjoyed having, as either in K-12 or at Davidson. And one of the first things that we talk about as a class, or if I'm talking with like policy people or something, I pose the question of like, do you think that this person just made up teaching? Or do you think that they like learned something about it? Like, do you think that the reason why the class seemed to go well, or the reason that they had this activity that you really liked, or they, that you got to do this interesting science thing, do you think that they just sort of woke up that morning and were like, I know, I'll do this? Or do you think they actually learned how to do it? And they learned how to do it, right? So I think one of the big things for me is trying to advocate for teaching as this profession in which it's, as you noted, complicated work that involves building relationships with human beings, and not just any human beings, like children, and creating a safe place where we feel like we can engage in complex work, that parents feel like they can drop their kids off at the beginning of the day and come pick them up and they've had a good day. That's a lot of responsibility. And so it's important, I think. There was a big movement, and there's, I don't know that it's the same as it has been, but certainly there was a big movement to really wonder about the value of teachers. Maybe we're all questioning it now that we've been at home with COVID. Maybe everyone's like, oh my gosh, teachers are amazing again. But there was certainly a movement for a long time where a lot of society and policymakers questioned the value of teachers and teacher education. And so I think a big part of our job, at least especially in the science ed world, is to be able to showcase there's some specialized knowledge and practices that a teacher can learn, that someone who's not a teacher can, as you noted, like Dan Lordy's sort of apprenticeship of observation, like we can watch someone do that work, but that doesn't mean you understand the reasoning behind it. It doesn't mean that you could do that tomorrow unless you had some of the same preparation. So we're really trying to sort of showcase to outside people and policy people, this is what's possible with really great preparation, like we would expect from doctors, like we'd expect from lawyers, like we would expect from clergy people, anyone who's engaged in sort of relational work, who goes through this preparation process. We would expect the same for teachers. So we really try and showcase that. But as you noted too, it really is important that our pre-service teachers or our future teachers have an opportunity for themselves to sort of think about, why do I think about teaching in a particular way? Like, why do I have these mythologized memories of what I think teaching is? Or they watch a Hollywood movie or something, those are the worst, and they think about, oh, this must be what teaching is like. So we really want them to sort of confront what they think teaching is and why they think that, and then to have a chance to rebuild it. I would say more specifically for science teachers, again, around the sort of disrupting of what counts as science, they rarely get opportunities to do science in their science classes. And so we have sort of double duty around what is science really like. It's this chaos, mingly, messy thing that's a lot of fun. It's a really amazing sort of way to make sense of the world that hopefully is grounded in communities, but you've never done it. So we have to do some science. So I'm always pulling on my science colleagues. We're always doing a lot of science in my courses, but then we have to attach the teaching to it. So like, you can watch me do all this cool science with you, but you are going to have to do this. And so it's one thing to watch me do it. It's another thing for you to have to do it, which takes me into our last question before we open it up, which is, it seems to matter a lot. We talk about this in both of our books. It seems to matter a lot that future teachers have opportunities to try out teaching, to have these teaching rehearsals. So what do you do that seems so powerful in your methods courses to help future teachers try out what they're eventually going to do with kids?
So since the work that I do is what we call social foundation, so it's the kind of work that cuts across whatever it is you're teaching. I really focus in our simulation work on, I talk about situations in which the identity of the student and the teacher and the sort of moment they're in is heavily salient for sort of figuring out what's going on and responding to it. So in our case, we have this sort of long cycle, but the whole point of this series of tasks is basically to give these pre-service teachers, and I tend in my classes to work with them early. Foundations program are intended to be just that. Students take these maybe as a sophomore if they're undergrad, first semester if they're a master's student, that kind of thing. When we sort of give them a scenario on paper and we say, okay, read this, it's very detailed, there's a strong setup, and we say, what do you think is going on here? Like, what do you think would happen if you walked into the situation? How do you think it would play out? What's forming that? So to your point about like, what are the lenses that you bring to this now? Which ones are you aware of? So they write some stuff, and then we send them into an interaction. I mean, we have an actor sitting there who's trained to play a student or a parent or a coworker. And these are intentionally stressful moments, which I know is part of what you've written about as well. And they ask the teachers to confront something. So they have a situation in which a Black 10th grade girl says to them, like, I think you're calling me out more in class for talking just because I'm one of the only Black kids, right? Which is something that we know from the literature and from talking with Black women and Black girls is something that's often felt, even if it's not actually said to a teacher, right? We have a scenario where there's a multilingual mom who's, you know, feeling maybe overwhelmed by what's going on at a parent conference. We have an older veteran colleague who's saying some like kind of sideways stuff that he needs called out on. And we put them in this situation where they can actually see like, okay, what would you do in this situation? And it's not armchair, well, I would, or drawing on this theory. It's like, no, you're sitting in the situation and there's a recording. What do you do? And so the learning for us really is not from what they do in that moment. It's using that. We draw on the choices that they make to then really dig into it. Why did you decide to do that? Why does it matter if you're a white teacher having a Black student say this to you versus if you're a Black teacher versus if you're a non-Black teacher of color, right? And how do you talk from those positions back to the student about this moment? You know, how, if you don't share the language of a parent, how do you communicate about things like test scores that you have on a sheet of paper? If you're a brand new teacher, can you tell a veteran teacher that what they just said is like ableist? So we kind of stick them in there and then we sort of work from that. And so we really leverage just the lived piece where they were like, that's not even what I thought I was going to do. And they just realize how much of this is what Dewey calls like habit, right? It's just like what comes out of us based on our lenses and our experiences and all that kind of thing. And then we sort of do some very careful teaching work to say, and is that the person you want to be in that moment? And look, here are some other possibilities, or here are other ways you could respond to it, or what does it look like to expand what's possible in this relationship if you do X, Y, Z? So our teachers don't leave these moments going like, I now have a plan for when this happens again. But I think they now say, here are the things I think I will be likely to do. And these are the things I want to lean into because it felt productive. And these are the things I know I'm going to have to slow down, think a little bit about, take my time, draw on colleagues, those kinds of things, to respond in a way that is fitting and that is responsive to the needs of the individual, especially if it's a situation where like, I haven't lived that myself. And so I have to really think about it. So that's a lot of what we do. And it's very embedded in coursework. So it's not just the experience, it's the experience with the readings and the conversation and that kind of thing. And I know your rehearsals have some similar things, but look a little bit different in certain ways too. So what is that like?
Yeah, well, I do want to highlight one thing that you said, well, sort of two things that you said. One is, I will say that it's very strange to be in the position of power that we're in and know that we have to like provide opportunities for our future teachers to what I would call engage in productive floundering, right? Like they have to work through some hard things. And it's because we know, like, I don't purposely say, I'm going to make this situation hard for you. I just know it will be hard, because it's pushing on their thinking in a way that they have not been challenged to do before. But it is just interesting to know that, like, yes, it's like a nefarious plan almost of like, yeah, it's going to be tough to make these decisions. I really actually emphasize in our teaching rehearsals, one of your colleagues at Vanderbilt, Paul Cobb, has this phrase that he uses called points of departure from sort of typical instruction. So we really leverage that phrase in my class, and we think about the moment-to-moment interactions that you have with kids matter a lot. And so we often have, we have teaching rehearsals in which our future teachers take on, we put them in a teaching team. And, you know, in secondary schools, which is where sort of my home is, there's like 4 core subjects, right? Biology, chemistry, or science, physics. So we put them, my future teachers, into like teaching teams, and they're in charge of teaching 10 to 12 hours to us as the students about something about their subject matter. What they get to pick, whatever they want to talk about. But one of the really important things that comes out of these teaching rehearsals is that they're like, oh, it's my friends in my class, we'll be fine. Oh, it's just David, he's a good professor, hopefully we'll be fine. But they quickly realize that they don't understand science and teaching as much as they think they do, and B, even though everyone is majoring in a science field, because you have to, according to the state of Michigan, to teach science, there's a lot of ideas about science floating around that don't line up with my future teacher's understanding of the canonical content. And so given these sort of, and they're very quick, all this quickly arises. And so we have them think about these sort of points of departure where you could imagine if you're in a classroom, and we try this out in our class, right? So you can imagine in a classroom, if you're working on a question or you're working on an interesting science problem, and a student raises their hand and asks something that you don't expect, that seems a little off topic or seems whatever, what you say next is hugely consequential, because you're going to signal to that student, I value you or I don't. I think your idea is important or I don't. I think you're important or I don't. So even in our teaching rehearsals, as I'm sure you see in your teaching rehearsals, these moments come up quite often. And so our particular brand of teaching rehearsals allows us to pause instruction. We get to call timeouts. And we get to talk about really puzzling things that come up in the moment as a really safe community of future teachers. And that seems to be really consequential for our pre-service teachers, because then they say things like, and I was truly surprised the first time I heard them say this, but they'll say things like, I'm really glad we had this teaching rehearsal in our methods class because I'm not afraid of kids anymore. And it seems a little ridiculous until you think about it, right? Because in science, especially, like in secondary science especially, you want to be seen as the person with all the answers. You want to be like the authority of the class. You're kind of positioned that way anyway. And so it makes a lot of sense that a question you weren't expecting, or a comment you weren't expecting, or an action you weren't expecting can throw you off. And it can make you feel like you're not in charge of the class. And so having these rehearsals be places for them to engage in this sort of productive floundering actually seems very beneficial for them later on, because then they know, okay, when I'm in like a high school physics class, if a kid says something that I'm not expecting, I now have practices, tools, talk moves, all of this sort of suite of things that I can say and do. Even if I still have no idea what they're talking about, I at least have practiced what it's like to engage in these conversations where we work towards something as a community, instead of having to be extemporaneous and figure it out on the spot. So they feel a lot more comfortable, especially around some of the complex science ideas that come up when we've had a chance to try it out as a group.
So David and I have now done what we tend to do, which is we have talked longer than we were supposed to. So now we will be quiet.
We have professed for a
Look
while.
forward to what people have to say.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. That was very interesting. And we do have a couple questions that have come in, and just a reminder, if anyone else has questions, you can send them in the chat to Grace. But Liz, I'm going to start with this one. This one is for you, but David, I think either can answer. But it says your situational rehearsals seem so valuable. What are some resources you would recommend that we could bring back to our schools to help develop some of the skills you are exploring through those rehearsals? Books, facilitators, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two, other than me, there's somebody really important that I would suggest. So Ben Dotger, Dotger, is a guy up at Syracuse. His wife also is there. I want to say her first name is Suzanne, and she's in science. But Ben Dotger is really credited with bringing the modern version of simulations to teacher education. He had a series of articles, and he has I think he has at least one book out called, and I think the first one that he came out with is called, oh, the name's going to escape me. I'm going to find, it's going to come to me in a second, but he actually published like this set of simulation material. So he's like, these are scenarios and here are the kind of questions you might ask. And it's pretty cut and dry in terms of like, here are things we've done and here's how you can go do them. When I started doing my work, I tried them. And what I found is that because I was really focused on super foregrounding these issues around identity and systemic oppression and that kind of thing, they didn't get me that. And so then we started writing our own and developed this, these pieces around it. So definitely his stuff is worth looking at. And it's just nice to see more cases of what it can look like. And then our book, which I think is going to go in the link at some point, Barb Stengel is my co-author that I wrote it with. We have a number of scenarios in there that are written, but part of what we at length try to explain is that like, so much of this is about what's in your local community. And so I think there's some stuff there that you're like, I could imagine this with this adjustment here, that kind of thing. But we do talk in there about like how you can develop the protocols, things to keep in mind. I mean, David's alluded to a lot of them. Like we've tried doing this work with in-service teachers, and that was a totally different ballgame because they didn't necessarily trust us. We didn't have a community. We don't do these, for example, in my class before around week 5, because the students have to know each other and feel like they can be vulnerable and admit that they said or did things that kind of make them look bad to each other before you can really get to the deep learning. And so I'm eager and interested to try this with maybe opt-in in-service teachers. It's usually a safe place to start. But those are two places that you could look, or to those two books that give you examples and that give you like things to keep in mind while you're doing this work. And I will just also say, like, I am always interested in what people are doing around. So please also just feel free to email me and be like, hey, we're thinking of this. Is there anything else you can think of? Or, you know, if you want to chat, it's always fun to do. So David, what else, who else can you think of?
Well, I actually think, I mean, those are lovely resources. I actually think I would also, like, even getting to the resources, I would think about the framing the teachers are bringing to the work. So I think Liz and I have seen enough examples, especially with like current teachers, where they try and take on, especially some equity rehearsals, but in an inequitable way, because they're treating the students from an inequitable perspective. And I can, you know, the quick example from the world of science education that I know applies to like math education as well, would be the idea of like trying to deal with students' misconceptions about the world. So that word comes up a lot when I'm dealing with teachers, and I actually ban that word from my class. I call that a bad word, because for lots of reasons, but the most important one is when you tell students or when you tell their families that they don't understand the world, there's a lot of damage that's being done. So we actually, when I work with current teachers, even before we sort of take on some of these teaching rehearsals, we actually try and think about like, what would it be like in your classroom if you created a place where students felt safe to share ideas no matter what the ideas are, and those are sort of built and worked on over time. And then we also try and simplify it to, let's pick like a problem that you want to work on. So in science, a big push is to have students like create models of complex phenomena. And maybe some of you are seeing that with your kids in your schools now. So modeling, for example, is like always a great place to start doing some of this work, because it's like a concrete thing that your students are working on that your teachers have to facilitate. And so it just gives us like a thing that we're doing for the year, or a thing that we're doing in our methods class, where we can specifically say, okay, what does it look like to help students work on this? How do we do this in an equitable way? And then everybody will start to make connections to other things that go on, because models happen in small groups, or they happen as a whole class. And so how do you create those kinds of spaces? But yeah, I think it's really important to help teachers see the work differently, and then make sure that the rehearsals are happening in an equitable way.
Awesome. So this year has been hard in so many ways of dealing with both the COVID pandemic and the pandemic of racism and its impact in our country. Schools were on center stage for both, especially with the Nice White Parents podcast and the Promise podcast out of Nashville. How has the race equity conversation changed over the past year, and have school systems shifted in engaging with this work?
Do you want to start that one, David?
I can, but then I don't know this other podcast that's out of Nashville, so I want to hear about that one. So I'll keep my answer shorter. For sure. In Michigan specifically, we also had, the governor was threatened to be kidnapped or something, right? So we've had a lot of extremist far right conversations in schools. So I would say the biggest shift that I've seen over the past 3 or 4 years in our sort of Michigan schools, and specifically and wonderfully in science classrooms as well, is to really think about, what does this mean I have to do as a teacher on a day-to-day basis with my students in my classroom, but also what does this mean for sort of the science and the math itself? So science and math are often sort of dissociated from politics and history and culture and race and equity work, even though they're inherently bound with it. So a lot of our teachers are trying to ask complex questions about, like, okay, so I have to teach the science concept, pick your science concept. What does that mean? How could we look at that from an equity or justice perspective? What does it mean when we want students, we're supposed to be, as Liz has pointed out, like, we're supposed to be grounding our work in students' lived communities. So how do I do that from a science perspective? How do I hear from students about what kinds of science problems that they're experiencing? And, I can tell you that Michigan State has been really instrumental in doing work in Flint with their water crisis. And so a lot of schools and a lot of science teachers there have actually been doing data collection for scientists and have been partnering with local scientists to do some water quality work. I would say that the climate crisis is another big example in science classrooms in Michigan, where there's been a lot of conversations that overlap with history and political science, and even some English classes around what do we do now that we're having this climate crisis, we're having a migration crisis. So what does science have to do with all of this stuff? So I've been really pleasantly surprised that these conversations are making their way into schools.
So I'm going to be, not surprising for most people who know me, a little more pessimistic than David. I think that the opportunity is ripe, and I can talk mainly for our local school district. And I would say that I'm not convinced that it's going to make a huge difference, that schools have or will take it up. So there's a guy that I read a lot of, who is kind of a foundations person, named David Laboure. And David Laboure has one of my favorite conclusions in a paper. And he basically says, like, we're at the part of the paper where you're supposed to give suggestions to fix it. And, when we say we're going to give these solutions, never mind that we've just spent all this time talking about how dysfunctional the system is and all this kind of thing. And I make my students read this in the first week, and it frustrates them because they're like, I'm taking this class, I'm becoming a teacher. Why would you make me read something that says, like, schools can't fix society's problems, right? But what he does in this paper is he lays out these things. He's like, hey, if you actually want to do something, here are 5 things. And one of the things that he says is be a pessimist, right? And he says, reformers tend to assume the worst about the current state of the school system. Anything would be an improvement, and assume the best about the effect of their proposed changes. So on the one hand, I'm glad to see that our local school district didn't jump and try to do things that they haven't done before, and so aren't particularly well equipped to do. Because to David's point previously, like, when people try to do that, often it goes poorly and it replicates really bad versions that end up on YouTube and Instagram and other places. And you're like, ooh, that school district, what were they doing? On the other hand, I think the two things I'm watching happen, and the promise is definitely tied to this, is like, there are people who say the same thing, that they want the same, outcomes, that they want changes for particular groups or in particular places, but they have phenomenally different ideas about how to get there. And so I think, especially here in Nashville, part of what I'm constantly trying to figure out to do, because I'm obviously making decisions as a teacher educator and as someone doing research around the area, I'm also putting my 3 children in this school district and having to make choices around that. And they have different needs and different identities that they carry into those school spaces. But there's a parent group here called Nashville Propel that is very outspoken. And they are diehard charter school, no excuses all the way. And like, that's a group that has really pushed my thinking around, like, I think we actually want a lot of the same things in terms of the end goal, but we have very different commitments around what it means to get there. And why do I think, as a white woman with, affluence, and I live in this certain part of town kind of thing, why am I convinced that I know better than they do? What would it look like to listen to and take seriously what they're saying? Where can we disagree? And where might I be getting in the way of work that needs to be done because I have a certain soapbox kind of thing? So I think that's the part of it. And then the other part of it, which is just, this is a nationwide phenomenon, is people have picked up words and they will use those words wherever. People have argued for everything in the last year in the name of equity, right? We need to open schools because of equity. We need to keep the schools closed because of equity. And we need to go online because of equity. And we need to get them off computers because of like, the word is just there. We're watching the same thing play out now with critical race theory. And I'm like, literally none of the people who say that we need to get rid of it know what that is or have read any of the people who talk about critical race theory. So I think the other thing that has happened in the last year is people have realized they can't not talk about it. That has been the one thing that's like not okay in a very public space. And so it's getting harder, but also more important to discern what people mean by what they say, what their actual commitments are to. And I think the time is definitely here for greater sort of community activism organizing that says, we might not see eye to eye on these things, but how do we come together? In Nashville last year, I spent a lot of time with a consortium of teacher prep programs. Nashville gets a little ironically referred to as the Athens of the South because we just have a ton of, or not the Athens of, well, they do call it that, but we have a ton of colleges and universities right here in Nashville, especially compared to the state as a whole. And we came together to talk about, like, how do we increase racial and ethnic diversity specifically within the teacher pool here in the district? And, in some ways, like, we're competitors, and in a lot of different commitments around what it looks like to prepare teachers well. But we came together to do that work because at the end of the day, it was one thing we could agree on. And so I think we need more things like that. I don't need to go be part of Nashville Propel. That group is really of and for Black families, in particular, historic Black families here in Nashville. But what does it look like to make sure that my work isn't getting in the way of what they are after for those kids and that kind of thing? And so I hope that's part of the response, is just this starting to listen to who you have overlapping goals with and how do you do work that doesn't get in the way, and finding those opportunities where you can actually work together. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is related. Question was, knowing the importance of preparation and the teacher shortage in so many places that lead to fast tracking teachers to certification, what policies or budget requests do we as parents and citizens ask for our Board of Education or local government to provide or invest our tax dollars into?
I love this question, and I bet Liz loves this question too. We are such a strange country when it comes to teacher education, because if you look at most other countries around the world, they have a national system of teacher preparation, right? So there's national incentives, there's huge efforts in place, especially in places like Scandinavia, to really incentivize the work. They try and draw in the best and brightest students to become math and science teachers, especially. They do like almost like a medical residency program. I know, like in Norway and Finland, for example. So you're not allowed to have your own classroom until you have 3 years under your belt working with experienced teachers, right? So when I talk to policy people, there's like a couple things that I try and tell them. One is, yes, oh my gosh, over the next 2 years, we're going to have a huge teacher crisis. And we have seen it in states like Kansas. We have seen it in states like, I guess Texas is another interesting example, where the state government has slashed spending for teachers, has slashed resources for schools, has slashed incentives for people to become teachers. And predictably, people stop becoming teachers. And then predictably, especially Black and brown students, those who have been marginalized by society anyway, typically get the least prepared teachers again. So it's one of the things that I always tell policy people is to think about how much time your kids spend with teachers in their life, in their early life, K through 12, and think about how you would want to then invest in making sure that they have the best people interacting with your kids all day long, because that's who teachers are. The other thing I have them think about is make sure that schools are places where teachers want to go. So when budgets get cut, when really hard decisions by schools have to get made, when they don't have the resources they need, like textbooks, whatever, it's really hard to convince people to become a teacher when schools are not a place that seem great. And so if you have any lobbying efforts, if you know policy people, we really need to invest in schools themselves and in districts themselves to make sure they are a place that teachers want to go to.
Yeah, so I'll just build off what David said briefly, and which is to say that like a lot of time the focus is on teacher pay. And teacher pay matters, right? But there's a bar there somewhere. I don't think we totally know where the bar is. But it's like, if it's not at a certain point, then that is probably the most important thing. But then there's other things like, do you ever actually get the planning period you were promised to plan and you're not dragged into meetings? Are you constantly covering for other people? Are you inundated with paperwork? Our teachers in the state of Tennessee right now, you know, the kids that have spent the least amount of time in person this year have only been back around 6 weeks. They then spent a week taking the state's test that was mandated. They're then taking what's called MAP testing. Again, if y'all have kids, yours may have done that, which is a growth test. And then like the younger kids are also doing, I mean, they don't get to teach, right? So they don't want to be in the building kind of thing. So, you know, thinking about there's money that takes care of pay and there's money that like, again, creates conditions. The other thing is just also thinking about like, what do the pipelines in your area look like? So again, that consortium of teacher prep programs that I was part of, one of the things that I always appreciated about it is that we kind of drew different kinds of people. Like Vanderbilt is definitely a best and brightest kind of school. Like we're going to get people, and David alluded to earlier, like these are people who played the game of K-12 schooling well. They understood how it worked. They could manage it, whether because they had resources or an aptitude that was identified early and encouraged, that kind of thing. We also need more teachers though, who are like, school was hard for me, or teachers who were like, I had a really hard time doing math, but I loved it. Like when you bring teachers into the building who weren't just like sort of academic all-stars, you end up with people who are often much more empathetic to kids who struggle, who don't fit within the system, and are more willing to find sort of subversive ways to resist it on behalf of, again, kids, families, and communities. And so that is where you tend to find some of the more alt-cert stuff. Like we have a local residency program here who does that work. And those are students who by and large can't get admitted to a Vanderbilt because of the various cutoffs that are even imposed on us. And that is both then on Vanderbilt to do work around that. But it is also a great way to find like different pathways for different folks into the program. And it's also much lower cost than a Vanderbilt license. So those are things that I think about in terms of money. Yeah.
So I know we're at time, but if y'all, there's one more question I'd like to get to if everyone doesn't mind. So someone says, as an elected member of the Atlanta Board of Education, I'm interested in building community and trust among our teachers and parents. Can your simulations rehearsals be applied to helping teachers in a diverse system learn from one another's experiences? How about parents who are threatened by folks from the quote, the other side of town? There you go. See, in the night on that one.
I think like now I'm sitting here like, what would that look like? Sure. I mean, I think you can, the general idea of rehearsal and simulations and that kind of thing they're just a tool, right? It's like, can you find a book for, can you play a game that would do, it's just a tool. And the question is like, what would the tool look like that uses it? But I think the biggest thing that springs to my mind is just, and again, David kind of alluded to this earlier, is that it's, the way we use them is not as a standalone, it's as part of this like bigger system, right? So, like parent panels obviously become super important in that kind of thing. Like, what does it look like to actually listen to each other in that setting and to understand the places where you overlap and can understand each other, and the places where you're like, I don't share that identity and I'm not ever going to be able to fully empathize, but I respect and can appreciate where you're coming from. And like, just a like sort of personal aside. So our youngest daughter is Black. Raising Zola and taking her through the school system is a different phenomenon for me than working with my 2 white children. But I am also not a Black parent, right? So like, I gained a new appreciation for what is necessary and what it looks like to have to like watch out for a Black girl in school, but I will never fully understand what it's like for Black moms, right? So I think those kinds of levels of like, what can I understand and speak to, and like push, and what are the things where, again, I have to really step back and listen. I think it would be interesting to think about. I think there are really fantastic things that can be done about developing greater understanding and community among parents. I think it would take me some time to think about what exactly it would look like to do that work, especially from outside of a school situation. But what I will say is the literature that my students read about family engagement in schools says just that more important than getting a parent to come into the school and put up a bulletin board or watch their kid do something in the classroom. It's about collective family engagement. It's about getting families to make connections with each other, because it creates a network and it distributes resources in ways that starts dealing with some of the inequities that arise across, especially race, class, and socioeconomic lines. There's work done in particular communities around finding what we call cultural brokers within communities. So there's a large Kurdish population in Nashville, and there are Kurdish families who go through a particular program with an organization to make them really knowledgeable about the school system, because then they become kind of a point person within their community to do some of that work. But this is really about getting all of those families to figure out how to work with and listen to each other. And so I would say, if that work can be done, I think that there is huge benefits at a systems level and not just at that individual level. So I think it's a great thing to think about. And I think there's great possibility there.
Yeah, I'll add on. It's appropriate maybe that I'm going last because I'm from Decatur, Georgia, right? So like 10 minutes east of Atlanta, there you go. The quick example that I would give of a really powerful sort of example of this work was something that I saw when I was in grad school at the University of Washington. So in South Seattle, as Liz was saying, it really helps if administrative people in a district decide this is we really want to make sure that we're connected to the community, and we really want to make sure that we are working collaboratively on sort of shared problems of schooling that we all identify and think are important. So a superintendent that I saw in just south of Seattle public schools was noticing that, like in some of my science teachers' classrooms, that a lot of Black and brown kids who in other classes weren't talking as much or weren't participating as much, they were talking and participating in my science teachers' classrooms. And they got really curious as to why that was. And so they started to talk with the kids, they started to talk with the families, and they eventually created this sort of a subcommittee, some sort of semi-permanent or permanent committee of students, teachers, parents, and administrators. It was like maybe 10 or 11 people that would sit down together, especially at the beginning of a school year, and they would identify a shared problem of practice that they wanted. So for example, like, how do we get the Black and brown kids talking more in all the classes and sharing their ideas? So when you name a problem like that with all this input from different stakeholders in a system, and then you think together about, we're going to focus on this problem. How is it that what does success look like? How will we know we're being successful or not? How should we change? What is each of our role in, because the superintendent has a different role than a parent, but we all have a role to play. So what do each of us work on that we can sort of work on this problem together? And then let's meet back up every couple weeks to check in about our progress. And so every year they think about a different problem that they want to work on, but people's voices are at the table. And then not only it's not just their voices at the table and then they leave, they're also proposing solutions and they're trying to document evidence of whether it's working or not. So real stakeholder conversations in which there's investment from everyone and everyone knows their role and they all kind of go, it's like teamwork, right? But it really does take these sort of systems level people to think about or be pushed to think about, how can I bring in community members to help us think about specific problems to solve together?
Awesome. Thank you. So thank you so much to David and Liz for joining us and for doing such a great conversation. I want to say thank you again to the class of 2001 20th Reunion Committee for putting this together, and do a little plug that there are going to be several back to school classes throughout the month of May and early June for all of the classes celebrating this year. And so if you check out davidson.edu/reunion, you can find a list of all of the classes. And so I really encourage you to sign up for other classes and hear from our great alumni who are doing just incredible things in their field and communities. And Grace is going to post the links to the books that Liz and David referenced, just in case you do want to use those resources or learn more. And we'll also include them in an email to follow up this event with a survey for your feedback as well. But thank you again, David and Liz. Thank you everybody for joining us. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank y'all.